Everyone needs a good breakfast. Med in the morning stays crunchy, even in milk.
It's Med in the morning here on Alive 107.3, and we continue to count down the days to the Wigtown Book Festival. So many big names appearing at Scotland's Booktown this year, including Alan Cumming, Cerys Matthews, David Baddiel, and James Cosmo, all of them stars in their chosen field. But there's a true legend appearing in the festival marquee, a man whose voice has guided us through some of the most amazing moments in Scottish sports broadcasting. And I'm delighted to say he joins me this morning. Let's say a very good morning to Dougie Donnelly. Good morning, Dougie. How are you?
Good morning, Lee. I'm fine. I'm overwhelmed by that build-up. Thank you for that.
It's true, Dougie. I mean, can I call you Dougie?
Of course you can. What else would you call me?
It's just very strange because I grew up watching you. I grew up listening to you. Like so many people, you are the voice of Scottish sport for a generation. How does that actually, does that resonate with yourself? Have you realised that?
People are very kindly and they say things like that. And yeah, I find that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with it all, to be honest. I'm just the luckiest guy in the world. I mean, I was in the right place at the right time. I was, the book's called My Life in Sport, which is slightly misleading because for the first, 16 years of my career, it was as much about music as it was sport. So I was just lucky. I was going to be a lawyer. I was dangerously close to having a proper job, but I was I was the social sec at the student union at Strathclyde University, studying law, into music, became social sec at a time when a lot of the big bands were playing the student union circuit, and I got into that. And then a DJ didn't turn up one Saturday night when we had 200 people waiting to eat, dance, and have fun, and I spoke the three words which maybe changed my life, because with committee, we all sat around saying, what are we going to do? We've got no DJ on a Saturday night. And I said, I'll do it. And that's kind of how it started. I was then paid the highest of Glaswegian compliments. I know bad. and that's how it started.
It's interesting you say that, because obviously you say the first 16 years of your career, it was the music, it was the DJ. You were a staple on Radio Clyde back in the day when Clyde was, I suppose, the biggest station in Scotland. You were there on the mid-morning show, a firm fixture. And again, how did it come about? Because Clyde at that time was a powerhouse. And a time
people kind of forget, Lee, I think, just what an impact that Radio Clyde made. It was the first of the commercial stations in Scotland, and suddenly the whole of the west of Scotland suddenly had a station that spoke in their language, if you like, that spoke with a Glasgow accent and covered all sorts of music. It wasn't just the chart hits of the day, and it made a huge impact. And I was very lucky to be there at the time. And eventually the great Andy Park, who was the programming genius who you've possibly heard of, and Andy was my first guide and mentor. And he stuck with me and he gave me a chance, and thanks to Andy, I then followed on and eventually got into TV, and now I'm swanning around the world, still swanning around the world, commentating in golf in the Asian tour of all things. So how lucky have I been?
You've been very, very lucky. You mentioned obviously Andy Park there. I mean, anyone, when you hear that name, there's usually a wry smile across their face, and there's a tale or two to tell, I suppose, and a tale that you can't tell as well. But anything you can share with us about that legendary broadcasting name?
It was different because at that time it was quite strictly organised in radio terms, as you know. It was the producer made the call, and you had a script and you did what you were told to an extent. Andy was different. He just said, hey, it's your show. This is the remit. This is what you're trying to do. And we had a sort of, what do you call it, an intercom system in the studio. And I'd be on air in the mid-morning show, and halfway through a record I'd be playing, the light would flash. And I thought, oh, it's the boss. And I would go on and I'd say, yes, Andy. He said, what is that you're playing? And I said, well, it's a band called Wet Willie and Street Corner Serenade. It's a great song. He said, I think it's a load of rubbish, but hey, it's your show. And he clicked off. Now, how many producers take that attitude? It's your show, off you go. And that was Andy. That was his style.
And obviously, you went from radio plays, you went onto television as you said. How did that actually come about? Was it something you were actively seeking, or did the chap come to your door?
Pretty much. I mean, it's to a large extent down to Archie Macpherson, because Archie, of course, was the main man at BBC Scotland Sport. And he phoned me one day and he said, "You want to earn 50 quid?" And at the time, I certainly wanted to earn 50 quid. And I said, "Go on then." He said, "We need somebody to toast the lassies at a Burns supper. Can you do that?" And I said, "Yeah, I can do that." So I went along and I did the toast of the lassies. And as it happened, Archie had brought along as a guest an Englishman called John McNicholas. Doesn't sound English, but he was. And he was a producer with the BBC in London. And he was attached to the BBC in Scotland for 6 months. And Archie had brought him along to see what a Scottish Burns supper looks like. And John and I got talking. And at one point in the evening, he said, "Listen, I know you do the morning show and it's all music, but all you've done all night is talk about sport, particularly football. I think you should come in and do an audition for me." And that was the Friday night. On the Wednesday night afterwards, I was in doing an audition for BBC Scotland. And the week after that, I was off to do a match report on Airdrie against Dundee.
What was the score?
Believe it or not, it sounds ridiculous, Lee, but in those days it was so primitive compared to now when we have the wall-to-wall coverage. But the BBC Scotland used to send reporters to all the big matches, but they left before the end to get the taxi back to the studio. So you would sit in the studio and then to camera, you'd say, "I've just come back from Ibrox or Parkhead or Palmerston or whatever it was." Well, it wouldn't be Palmerston, I suppose, not at that time. But I'd been sent to Airdrie, Broomfield, and I left 20 minutes from the end. Airdrie were beating Dundee 3-1. So I'm going back and I'm sitting in the back of the taxi making up my story about how Airdrie had dominated and Dundee were disappointing. Got back into the studio and the final score was 3 each. So that was a lesson. You never prepare too much. Just be prepared to change your script. And that was my very first match report. Airdrie 3, Dundee 3.
I mean, we're talking about the book, obviously, My Life in Sport, which you're coming to Wigtown Book Festival to talk about on October the 4th. But how do you fit a life like yours into one book? I mean, obviously, this has got to be severely edited highlights.
I've been very lucky. I mean, I was timing is everything, Lee, as you know, and I was lucky that at a time when not only was it a golden age for Scottish sport, with all the football, we qualified for 5 World Cups out of 6 at that time. Dundee United and Aberdeen were the new firm. They were emerging and dominating. On top of that, we had 2 rugby Grand Slams in 6 years. We had Stephen Hendry, the world snooker #1, all our golfers still playing in Ryder Cups and winning majors, and so on and so on. And the BBC had all of that because there was no Sky. There was ITV were not really interested in much except football. So I got the chance to do all these different sports because I was young and enthusiastic. And they used to say to me things like, "What do you know about curling?" And I'd say, "Well, not an awful lot. You better give me a week." And the next thing I was off to the Winter Olympics to commentate on curling. So again, just happy accident, very lucky. I did my homework. I'm not being entirely immodest. I did my research and I learned about all those sports that I didn't know very much about. And it went on from there. I was just hugely fortunate in my timing.
And you covered everything. You mentioned football, rugby, snooker, golf, Olympics, the Commonwealth Games as well.
Yes.
So many amazing events to get. Is there any sporting moment you didn't get the opportunity to cover? And as a fan, you were sitting watching it thinking, "I wish that had been me."
Not many, and that sounds ridiculous, but that's how much the BBC had at the time. The one that I did miss was when Aberdeen reached the Cup Winners' Cup final in 1983. and ITV had the rights to the British clubs in the Cup Winners' Cup. So they covered Aberdeen all the way to Gothenburg when they beat Real Madrid to win the Cup Winners' Cup. And we had most of the others, but we didn't have Aberdeen when they won the Cup Winners' Cup. And I've always regretted that, because I was quite close to Fergie, and he remains a friend even now. But I wasn't there for the big one, and that's a shame. I'd like to have been there.
We see so many things nowadays. I mean, if we look at, as you mentioned, also we've got Sky, we've got TNT, we've got Netflix now, we've got Amazon Prime. All these different companies have all of a sudden, it's like they've reinvented the story of sport in many aspects. But somebody that's been there and experienced it, what is it that actually makes a great sports story?
Oh, a great sports story, a skill at the highest level. I suppose we all like to see the very best doing what they do at the top of their form. I think it sometimes comes down to something as simple as that, really, that we love to see sport at its best. It's great if it's a Scottish or a British sportsman or woman. That's huge. But I think as a kid, like so many kids across the world, I just fell in love with sport and I wanted to watch it. And I was very lucky that I got in my own small way to be part of it, to sit and commentate on four ordinary but extraordinary Scottish women, for example, winning the curling gold medal in Salt Lake City. That remains an absolutely wonderful memory to be there and have the chance to do that, and to be standing in the gantry at the Stade de France, opening match of the 1998 World Cup, Scotland against Brazil, and thinking at the time, just in those few seconds before the music played and we know we're going to this huge audience back home in Scotland, I remember thinking, this is a big deal. Scotland against Brazil in the opening match of the World Cup. This probably won't happen again. I didn't know that we were never even going to get to a World Cup, far less play Brazil. But those were very fortunate moments for me.
When you mentioned that moment, I remember exactly where I was when that game was taking place. I was standing in a Safeway supermarket aisle that had a bank of TVs up, and I think every man in the store was standing watching that game. It was about to kick off and take place, while everybody else was just doing the shopping around them. It was absolutely amazing. Like I say, you were lucky enough to be there. Dougie, you have been the voice of sport for so many of us growing up. When I was telling some of my friends I was going to be lucky enough to speak with you this afternoon, they were instantly done the top sports broadcasters from our life, and there was yourself, there was Jill Douglas, and there was Jim White.
Yes,
we don't have really a broadcasting panel like that anymore. That's really in the consciousness of everyone. Who do you think we should be keeping an eye on to fill the steps of you three broadcasting giants moving forward?
Oh, that's difficult for me to say, Lee. If I mention a couple of names, I'll miss out somebody important. I think that when I got to work with Bill McLaren and sit beside Bill McLaren, who was and Peter Alice, and Bill and Peter were great friends and colleagues, and I, as a young broadcaster, tried very hard to emulate them. I was never going to get to that level. And all I would say to any young broadcaster when you get your chance is to try to take the chance, watch as much as you can, try and watch the best. And the names you've mentioned are right up there. Take your opportunity, do your homework, and hopefully you get as lucky as I did.
And of course, it's much more difficult for people to get lucky now because, as you say, the broadcasting world has changed so much over the past 3-4 decades. Although there's a proliferation of channels out there, the actual pool of opportunity is so small. If people are going and looking to get into broadcasting, whether that be radio, whether it be television, what is the one piece of advice that you would give them? Because there'll be many demo tapes, there'll be many demo reels, there'll be much rejection, but what should people do?
It's the fairly predictable advice, Lee, really. You were probably given it yourself. Be yourself. Don't try and sound like somebody else that you maybe admire or think is the key. Be yourself. Let your own personality come over. and certainly do your research. That's absolutely key. You can't be caught out not knowing what you're talking about. So those, I mean, they're not world-shattering pieces of advice, but they're absolutely basic, and you really have to do it. When I did my audition tape for Radio Clyde all those years ago, the reaction of the Andy Park that we mentioned earlier was, "Why are you trying to sound like Emperor Roscoe?" Now, I'm sure your listeners don't remember Emperor Roscoe. He was an American on Radio 1 at the time, and he was an American and sounded like it. And a lot of us thought that's how DJs had to sound. They had to sound American. And that was before the local radio stations all came on like your own. And suddenly we were all able to sound like the people we were. So I wasn't very successful trying to be Emperor Roscoe, but it worked out okay.
That worked out not too bad. You see, there's one final thing I need to ask about you before we let you go in. And thanks again for spending your time with us here at Med in the Morning.
Not at all.
American President Bill Clinton at the Royal Albert Hall. How did this even come about?
A very good question, Lee. It came about because a couple of pals of mine, Brian Whittle, the athlete, who's now an MSP, and Derek Stark, rugby internationalist, had set up an events company just at the end of their playing days. And somehow they'd managed to persuade President Clinton, or Bill Clinton, he was the ex-president then, to come and do 3 nights, one in Dublin, one in Glasgow, and one at the Royal Albert Hall. And the only condition that Bill Clinton had laid down was that he didn't want to be faced with a political interviewer. He didn't want it to be just about politics. So he said, get me somebody that will talk about something other than politics. So the boys, for some reason, thought I could do it, and I did. And it was one of the great thrills of my life, especially, again, those moments in your career when you think, wow, how lucky have I been? Standing backstage at the Royal Albert Hall, about to walk on and say, please welcome the 42nd President of the United States, Bill Clinton. And walking on with them, and the huge applause from the crowd, and thinking, I'm just a little guy from Glasgow. How did this happen? Very lucky.
Very, very lucky indeed. And we are lucky to have you coming to the Wigtown Book Festival Friday, the 4th of October. It's going to be 6 o'clock in the Annandale Distillery Festival Marquee. You can get your tickets right now, wigtownbookfestival.com. Dougie, I look forward to catching up with you there, my friend. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Absolute pleasure, Lee. We'll see you at Wigtown.